Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Introduction to Mind and Will. This week, we're beginning our 3-week investigation into consciousness. So, our first readings then are Nagel, What is it like to be a bat? And responding to him, Kathleen Aikens, What is it like to be boring and myopic? Okay, so we're going to begin with Nagel here. We started this class with Nagel, right? Nagel gave us this puzzle that we are now returning to. So the puzzle was this: if the mind is just supposed to be the brain, why does it seem like there are certain aspects of my experiences that cannot be observed when I look at the brain? So, for example, when I take a bite of a chocolate bar, if you're looking in my brain, why is it the case that you're not able to find the taste of chocolate, my taste of chocolate, when you're looking at the brain? Hmm? Well, in What It's Like to Be a Bat, or What Is It Like to Be a Bat, Nagel seeks to give us a better understanding of this particular puzzle. So, the background of this piece has to do with this observed phenomena Nagel is seeing amongst philosophers of mind at the time. Philosophers of mind were starting to engage in what we call reduction, right? So, a reduction occurs when you try to explain one phenomena in terms of much simpler phenomena, right? You try to demystify in a certain way one phenomena into simpler phenomena, right? So the examples that philosophers of mind started to look to, we've seen already in some of the literature we've read, right? Lightning, it turns out, just is electrical discharge. And heat, it turns out, just is mean kinetic molecular energy, right? So we're taking these interesting phenomena and finding out that we can actually reduce them to these simpler phenomena. Okay, so inspired by this, philosophers of mind started to think maybe we should do the same for the mind, right? Maybe we should take the phenomena, this rich phenomena of the mind, mental states, and reduce them to a purely physical phenomena. Nagel thinks that is a mistake. So why? Where does the reduction of the mind go wrong? Well, Nagel thinks that ultimately they're always going to be incomplete. When you have an attempt at reduction that is incomplete, it is unsuccessful. A reduction, in other words, cannot leave anything out. And what Nagel wants to say is that these kinds of attempts at reducing the mind to something like the brain, for example, are going to fail because they don't include any account of consciousness. A successful reduction, then, because it has to include all of the aspects of a phenomena, have to have some kind of theory of consciousness. And because there's not going to be a way for the physicalist to provide this, Nagel thinks these reductive accounts will always be incomplete. They'll always be unsuccessful. Okay, so what are they leaving out then? He's saying consciousness. What does that mean? Well, specifically, Nagel is talking about the subjective character of conscious experience. What is that? Well, it's the experience of being a creature like you. It's your inner mental life. It's your taste of chocolate, your experiential quality, right? Okay, well, why can't physicalist views capture that kind of thing? Well, Nagel says it's because it's intimately tied to you. There is no way for us to remove your perspective from the explanation without losing the phenomena altogether. So I cannot, for example, try to understand your taste of chocolate while removing your perspective. In doing so, I lose your taste of chocolate. So, why is this the case? More on the next slide. Physical explanations and how they work. Why we cannot capture the subjective nature of consciousness with purely physical views can be understood by examining how physical explanations are supposed to work. Okay, so typically, always actually, Nagel argues, when we give scientific explanations, we're attempting to move away from a subjective viewpoint towards an objective understanding, right? So we're trying to go away from our individual views on a thing to an objective understanding of how it really is. So when we go to understand lightning, we're moving away from our individual perceptions of the phenomena to a more perspectiveless, which is to say, objective view of the phenomena. But this works for things like lightning and heat because those are external phenomena. They exist outside of us. So we should expect that a purely objective explanation is right for those things. They don't exist internal to us. They exist outside of us. And therefore, our subjective viewpoints of them is going to be incomplete, right? But this doesn't hold for conscious experience, because conscious experience, especially the subjective character of conscious experience, exists within us. It exists within us. And therefore, to take an objective viewpoint of it is to lose it, right? It isn't outside, it's inside. Therefore, a kind of understanding, as though it were external, is simply going to lose the phenomena altogether. In other words, we cannot try to get rid of our perspectives when we are trying to understand our perspectives. Okay, so how do bats fit into all of this? Right? The article is, what is it like to be a bat? Well, Nagel wants to use them to illustrate the point. Okay, so he wants us to think about bats because, one, he thinks that bats are close enough to us that most people are going to say, sure, they have some kind of experience, right? But second, they're importantly different from us where their experiences are concerned. Why? Well, they fly around, they eat bugs. Most importantly, however, they use echolocation. So the likelihood of you having similarities in experience between, well, yourself and a bat is extremely low, right? You can't relate, in other words. Okay, on that note, is there any way that you, as a human, could imagine what it's like to be a bat? Could you imagine it? Well, Nagel says no, you can't, because you're locked into your human perspective. You could imagine what it's like to fly around and eat bugs. Maybe you could even imagine what it's like to echolocate. But all of those imaginings are going to be as a human. You're going to be imagining what it would be like to be you flying around, clicking and hearing sounds in return. You cannot imagine what it's like for a bat to be a bat. You are stuck in your perspective, right? But we can know all kinds of physical facts about bats. So why can't we understand what it's like for a bat to be a bat? What's missing? Well, Nagel says it's that subjective character of their experience. Because you're not a bat, you can never grasp that component of their experience. Okay, so he's given us an example of why this is a problem, right? This problem, he wants to note, applies everywhere. It's not just that you're not going to be able to relate to bats, you're not going to be able to understand their particular kinds of experience. This applies between people as well. He gives a case to make it exceptionally clear, right? He says a person who was born blind, for example, is not going to know what it's like for me, a person who was not born blind, to experience, and vice versa. I cannot know what it's like to be a person who was born blind, right? You can't know what that perspective is like because you are locked in to your own, right? You're locked into your own. Okay. So what's the conclusion then? These what it's like features of consciousness can't be understood by anyone but the person or thing possessing them. But if that's true, then there's no way we can ever give a physicalist explanation of the mind, because it's always going to be incomplete. It's going to leave out this particular perspectival quality of consciousness. Importantly, however, must note, right, this does not mean that dualism has to be true. It could be, for example, that physicalism is still true. It could be that a physicalist explanation could never satisfy And yet, all mental things, all features of consciousness really are just physical. What it would mean, though, is that that feature, the subjective quality of consciousness, is something that is just forever beyond our understanding. We're never going to be able to grasp this kind of thing, this kind of perspectival nature of consciousness. So, the hardest problem within philosophy, then, is not how the mind and the body are related. It's how we can account for this kind of conscious experience. Indeed, in the philosophy of mind today, we just refer to this as the hard problem. Whether or not the hard problem is genuinely hard really depends on who you're listening to, right? Nagel certainly thinks it's hard, insurmountable even. We might never be able to understand the nature of consciousness, right? Other philosophers, as we'll see in coming weeks, want to dismiss this notion. Okay, but first, let's look at Aikens. So Aikens, in her "What Is It Like to Be Boring and Myopic," which is mostly a description of what she takes bat experience to be like, right? Boring and myopic. She thinks that Nagel is wrong, at least wrong, in his claim that scientific investigation always goes from the subjective outward, right? From the subjective, the inner, to the objective world outside, and thus can never be effective in the other direction. Right? She wants to argue that from an objective viewpoint, we could learn a whole lot about what a bat's subjective experience must be like. So, to make the point, she is going to take on this positive project of actually looking at what bad experiences must be like, instead of simply adopting Nagel's negative conclusion that we simply cannot know. So, before we move on, I want to note that Nagel, to be clear, has not argued for this move. Nagel has simply suggested, he has simply suggested that you can never gain an understanding of anything subjective from an objective point of view. Okay? But he has not here defended that notion. So Nagel doesn't really have much of an argument, right? He has a claim. Aikens is not only pointing out to us that there is no argument here, there's no reason Nagel has given us for us to believe that that's the case. She's going to take on the additional task of trying to show that his claim is false. So, to do this, she wants to explain what kinds of things we can learn about bad experience from an objective point of view. This leads us into what you might call bat science. Right? So, we're not going to dive into all the technical details here. Just note that Aikens goes to great lengths to describe all kinds of things that we could possibly know about bat experience, given what we know about the physical facts about sound, bat behavior, and bat anatomical structure, before she even looks into the brain, which she does also do. So it's fairly extensive. It's very interesting. So I do encourage you to look at it, but we don't have to get into all the technical details here. A couple things. We know, for instance, that a bat's perceived world is a lot more limited than ours because they use sound to represent the world, right? They use sound to get around. And sound, as we know, does not as faithfully carry information as far as light does, right? So sound disperses much more readily than light does. We also know that bats, because they use varying frequencies when they're echolocating, depending on what stage of hunting they're in, they have discrete bands of awareness, unlike ours, which appear to dissolve into gray. So the idea here is that you have a periphery to your vision. At some point, the visible objects fade into gray. That's not exactly how it works for bats, Aikens says. Instead, bats have these kind of concentric circles of clarity. So at the center, nearest to their nose, very clear, but at at a certain distance out, things are slightly less clear in a rigid, predictable way, right? At certain intervals. And this continues out to a few different zones until things just vanish altogether. So it's not the case that there's this gradual fade to gray. there are levels of discrete quality, right? Very unlike the way we perceive the world. So that, amongst many other things that Akins brings out, shows that we can know a lot about what it's like to be a bat. But she knows that Nagel isn't going to be satisfied with this kind of explanation. That's because her answer to the question, what is it like to be a bat, has to do with something like, what are bad experiences like? Nagel, she thinks, is more concerned with something like a point of view. Nevertheless, she thinks that she has shown that we can know a lot about a thing's inner life from the outside in, moving from the objective to something about the subjective. So the idea then of capturing the subjective through this kind of objective analysis is not going to be as hopeless or as empty as Nagel thinks it is. We're just going to have to work really hard at it. But when Nagel is talking about this kind of point of view, she thinks that really the only thing left for this kind of thing that wouldn't be captured by this notion of, well, what are bad experiences like, that she thinks she has really talked about, would be something like representational capacities. So representational capacities are just like the ability to conceive of a world with individual objects in it. Further, to consider yourself as a part of that world. A part, meaning different from, right? You are situated in the world, but are somehow different from the world and all of the individual objects within it. So it's this kind of being able to take the perspective of a thing in the world that she thinks is really the only thing left for Nagel to point to that would be missing from this kind of view of what bad experiences are like. And she says, yeah, it's not clear whether or not bats have that kind of thing. That bats have this sense of being an individual in a world with other objects, right? It's not clear, she says, that bats have that. But, she concludes, if we can make progress on that other question, what is it like to be a bat in the sense of what are bad experiences like? There is a chance, she says, we could make progress on this question too. We're just going to have to try. So at the end of the day, we cannot simply assume that Nagel is right, that we cannot ever capture the subjective nature of experience from the outside in. Okay, so next week, we're going to stay on this hard problem of consciousness, right? Akins does not have the final word. We're going to see two more reasons for thinking that this hard problem of consciousness really is just insurmountable for a physicalist view of the mind. Then the week after that, we'll see some responses to those kinds of ideas. But this conversation is far from over. So don't be settled just yet, right? We're going to see much more still to come. But until then, stay healthy, stay safe.